She mourned her husband's death, but Carroll Russell did not wallow in her grief.
I'm living through the lonely adjustment of having lost my dear husband. Our marriage was one of romance and great happiness always.
She wrote to an Australian relative who'd offered condolences, but...
And I don't remember her ever saying, "Oh, I miss your father so much, and I just don't know what to do with myself."
I've had a deluge of letters of sympathy, and friends have been very kind. I have a large family and much to live for, so I cannot feel sorry for myself.
Mother just wanted to get the hell out. I think living in that house all alone depressed her a bit.
She wanted to sell the house and throw out everything that was there. She threw out all of our possessions.
And I had a stamp collection, and that just disappeared.
I was mad at her. I had a lot of nice letters from Dad and Uncle Harold and all that gone.
She stayed in Chicago, but moved from low-rise Hyde Park on the south side to a north side high-rise apartment building in the elegant Gold Coast neighborhood. 70 East Cedar had a doorman and marble floors and statuary in the lobby.
But she turned a corner. She was in a different world.
Her mother-in-law, Adeline Kidd, moved with her to the north side. Daughter Anne, undone as she put it by her father's death, moved back to Chicago after her first year at Wells College to live at 70 Cedar. For Harold Swift, the death of his best friend Pete Russell was a second major loss in 2 years. In 1948, his older brother Charles, chairman of the board of Swift & Company, had died. Harold, vice chair of the board since 1937, replaced Charles as chair. Harold's biographer Dorothy Swift said something had to give.
He found himself with increased family and business responsibilities. His commitment to the university remained the same, but his strength was no longer equal to it.
In 1949, Harold Swift stepped down as chair of the U of C board after nearly a quarter century, though he remained a trustee and avid university booster.
I've always been grateful that I knew all the presidents of the university.
Lawrence Kimpton replaced Robert Hutchins as university president. After the Hutchins whirlwind, Swift saw Kimpton, a philosophy PhD who Hutchins had brought to the U of C to oversee development projects, as a leader in retrenchment.
We need to strengthen the foundations again of the brilliant superstructure which we have.
Just 2 weeks after Paul Russell's death, Adeline wrote her sister Anne with surprising news. She was engaged. Lindy drew out the suspense.
By now, you're wondering which one it'll be. Well, I've decided after hours and hours of serious thought that marrying George is about the most wonderful thing I can think of.
George Bogert was a young lawyer whose parents owned a farm near Lakeside. His father, a U of C law professor, and mother were Hyde Parkers who knew the Russells. Lindy and George had met at a party in Union Pier. Carroll Russell writing in the summer of 1949.
George enters the plot, which is rather filled up at the moment with Bob Caldwell.
Caldwell was the diplomat Lindy had met in Morocco. She had been studying with Martha Graham in New York through most of 1949 and being wooed on the phone by George.
I went to all the performances in Chicago of modern dance, got to know all the names, and always mentioned it to her in New York. I think she was impressed.
Carroll Russell noted circumstances helped George's pursuit of Lindy in the fall of 49.
She flies home to spend Thanksgiving and is caught there with an emergency appendectomy. She has to stay home until January 1st, which gives George his chance.
The engagement announcement said the exact wedding date depended on when the Scherers could get away from a new tense Cold War assignment in Hungary. The bride's mother pronounced herself delighted, but Lindy's younger brother Harold worried that her unending unselfishness might have led her to a match that ensured she'd stay in Chicago to comfort her newly widowed mother. Within days, Lindy and her mother were off to Palm Beach for a month with Harold Swift and other friends to plan a wedding. Harold Swift would host the nuptials in July. He had Clarence Cook time seasonal plantings to be in full bloom for the event. Paul walked his sister down the aisle on the hill in front of the Swift home. Wedding vows exchanged between bird baths sporting massive arrangements of gladiolas. The wedding followed by a reception at the Russell home next door. Within a year of the wedding, Carroll Russell had a new man in her life, Sidney Harris, 19 years her junior, a just-divorced syndicated columnist who would go on to write 11 books, liberal, opinionated, sometimes abrasive.
She and Sidney were quite an item for, a year or two, I guess.
Harris was a U of C grad and devotee of the Great Books program. Indeed, he and Carroll Russell and the Bogarts attended a Great Books event in Colorado together. Harris came to Lakeside on occasion and also squired Carroll around the city. Vocationally and temperamentally, he was a man about town. He mentioned her obliquely as a friend in at least one column. After months of closeness, though, Harris announced somewhat abruptly he was marrying someone else. Carroll Russell traveled to Europe in 1951, visiting the Scherers at their new post in Hungary. She and daughter Carol then embarked on a trip to Vienna and Italy. The Scherers were in Budapest during the coldest days of the Cold War. The Soviet-backed government made life very uncomfortable for American diplomats, posting a sign on the Scherers' front gate that said, "Buy peace bonds and give an answer to the American imperialists." In July of '51, Hungary expelled 3 American diplomats, including Bud Scherer, charging he was a spy. The Scherer family was given 24 hours to pack up and leave the country.
The diplomatic note arrived at about 1 p.m., which was an inconvenient time because Vienna was 5 hours away.
Carol Scherer would write in her memoir,
"We had 2 personal cars, so we could take a significant amount of personal effects and still leave the backseat empty for 2 small people and their peanut butter sandwiches."
Despite a flat tire en route, the Scherers, with Bud driving a second car with a handgun at his side, reached the border with Austria with a half hour to spare. Their next posting, in Washington for 4 years, would be calmer. Back in the U.S. in 1951, Paul Russell Jr. was finding romance.
She was from an old Southern family.
He was a medical officer, an Air Force lieutenant, when he met Aline Lummis in Texas. She was Houston Society royalty, the great niece of William Marsh Rice, who founded Rice University. Film and aviation mogul Howard Hughes was Aline's cousin. Her engagement was big news in Houston society and opened a door.
I, of course, talked to her about Lakeside and said, "Why don't you come to Lakeside?" And she mentioned it to her mother, and she said, "You're not going to Lakeside without a ring."
Aline appears in Swift guest books in August of 1952, well after getting her engagement ring, and just a month before she and Paul were wed in Texas. Paul's mother and siblings were all in the wedding party except Lindy, back in Chicago, tending to newborn Nikki. Harold Swift not only attended, but was included in the large family photo. None of the groom's biological uncles were there. The Houston Chronicle pronounced the black tie affair the outstanding social event of the week, describing Aline's bridal gown at length. Carroll Russell often made the society pages of Chicago newspapers, usually attending charity fundraisers. She had inherited her mother's devotion to the cause of the underdog, though, unlike Hattie Mason, she was not motivated by organized religion.
They put me into a boys' choir at an Episcopal church. Tried to get my mother to join me in a religious retreat, and she said, "Oh, not me." Did not interest her at all.
I feel a sense of duty to mankind. I believe in service to others.
Yeah,
but that's my kind of religion.
Tacked on the back of a door, which she looked at every day at home, is an enlargement of a wonderful photograph of Mother's idol, Albert Einstein. In the left lower hand corner, typed on her own typewriter, is affixed a quote from Einstein, which comes as close as anything to her own credo. "Man is here for the sake of other men. Above all, for those upon whose smile and well-being our own happiness depends, and also the countless unknown souls with whose fate we are connected by a bond of sympathy."
She raised money for arts groups and social causes, particularly those focused on the plight of African Americans in Jim Crow America. She was on the boards of the United Negro College Fund and Chicago Urban League, sometimes a bridge to other wealthy white Chicagoans.
She never said, "Let's make it interracial." She said, "I have some friends that I think ought to be a member of this."
Etta Moten Barnett was a colleague on the Chicago board of the United Negro College Fund.
She looked at people as human beings. And it was the one person I know in all of my life that I've ever met was who you felt. You know, that we have antennae, and you can feel the real and the unreal. And you always talk real about Carroll.
She also made it a point to support black artists. An abstract painting which hung in her lakeside dining room for years was the work of Lorenzo Pace, a young graduate of the Chicago Art Institute School, who would go on to create and teach art, to write children's books about African American history, and create a huge marble monument, Triumph of the Human Spirit, that marks the spot of a burial grounds for enslaved people in Lower Manhattan.
The beak of the antelope points towards directly to the African burial ground and points to the ground where the African were discovered.
A sculpture by artist Douglas Williams was installed in front of the Russell home in Lakeside in 1963, a family of spoons embracing each other. It doubled as a jungle gym for grandchildren. In the 50s and early 60s, the tennis court at Chickeming Farm was a hub of social activity. Harold Swift hosted a Labor Day tournament, and summer weekends brought lots of competitors, though the number of players was often dwarfed by those dressing for socializing rather than sport. Carroll Russell continued to be a North Star in the Swift social constellation, along with family visitors like Harold's niece, Ruth Van Ice, and his nephew's wife, Lydia Swift, and Peter Backwin, the grandson of Harold's sister Helen, like his great-uncle, a natty dresser with a courtly manner. There were new faces in the 50s. University President Lawrence Kimpton moved into one of the Swift cottages. James Brown IV, head of the Chicago Community Trust, became Swift's most frequent houseguest. U of C graduate Chuck Percy, the newly minted president of Bell & Howell Corporation, often brought one of his company's cameras to Michigan. Percy would later be elected U.S. Senator from Illinois. Bridge remained a favored Swift pastime, and Harold Swift continued to be interested in education. The legend above his fireplace read, "Still I am learning." In the spring of 1954, Lakeside would take on a new role in service to the university. Harold Swift hosting trustees at the first of 5 Lakeside conferences, meetings that focused on reversing declines in university finances and neighborhood. As Swift put it,
on the part of many parents, the university neighborhood is looked upon as a dangerous slum area. So our problem of attracting students to our first 2 years is far from simple.
The university's efforts would be criticized as racist urban removal, the forcing out of minority residents, though Hyde Park did eventually stabilize as one of the city's few integrated neighborhoods. While Swift had consistently supported Robert Hutchins over the years, Hutchins' reforms left university balance sheets in disarray. $6 million in reserves had shrunk to just $500,000.
Certainly these Lakeside conferences during the Kimpton administration were very important in terms of Kimpton bring the board along, basically to repudiate a lot of what Hutchins did.
One trustee would write Swift after one of the Lakeside conferences,
"I don't believe it would have been as attractive or productive if it had been held anywhere other than in your home."
In 1955, Harold Swift turned 70, the mandatory retirement age for trustees. A surprise birthday party was arranged, formal dress, at Chicago's swanky casino club, the invitation noting,
"In view of Harold's modesty and unusual attitude towards birthdays, there should be no presents and no adulatory odes or poems read."
But the Russell players provided theatrical entertainment at the party, behind the kitchen curtain. Carroll Russell and her daughters and sons-in-law, billed as mere husbands, cast themselves as the staff at Swift's Lakeside home. No script for that production survives. After the party, Harold Swift would send handwritten thank you notes to guests like Ann Russell, expressing appreciation for the special thought of giving the portrait of me to the university. This portrait of Swift, done by his old friend Lawrence Beal Smith, that hangs in Hutchinson Commons to this day. Artist Smith also created this parody portrait of Swift, reading what appears to be a meat catalog. It's unclear whether that survives. 2 months after his party, Swift was at Carroll Russell's apartment to celebrate the 90th birthday of Pete Russell's mother, Adeline.
He was all constantly thinking about us and what he could do for us.
In 1954, Paul and Aline Russell were about to leave for London, where Paul would work with Dr. Peter Medawar, regarded as the father of transplantation surgery. Just before their departure, they dined at Harold Swift's home.
We had said goodnight, and we were going down the stairs. Halfway down the stairs, he came after us, and he said, "Well, I want you to have this." He had an envelope, and in it was $1,000. He made arrangements for us to have a place to stay in London.
On Anne Russell's 21st birthday, Harold Swift gave her a gold watch that had belonged to his mother, Anne Swift. When Harold Russell applied to law school at Chicago, Harold Swift called the dean on his behalf. When the Bogarts moved to a larger Chicago apartment in 1957, Harold Swift wrote to offer furniture he'd had in storage since moving from the Blackstone Hotel to the Pearson Hotel, not far from Carroll Russell's North Side apartment. And in the mid-50s, Harold Swift gave the Sharers money to engage Lawrence Beale Smith to paint a portrait of 7-year-old Susan, helping 2 friends with one subtle stroke. He would similarly arrange for paintings of Amy Bogart and Kate Russell a few years later. He asked the girls' parents not to let Smith know that he had paid for the portraits. In 1956, the Sharers were again assigned a post behind the Iron Curtain, Prague, Czechoslovakia. Carroll Russell and daughter Anne took a trip to see them. Anne's first trip abroad, reported the Chicago Tribune. They landed in Spain, visited Tunisia. Anne recalls camels spitting at her. And then spent considerable time in Italy, some of it with Carroll and Susan Scherer, and meeting up for at least one night in Rome with Harold Swift, Charlie and Audrey Cutter, and James Brown IV, eating on Good Friday at Alfredo's. A hallmark of the trip, dramatic correspondence between Anne and her beau back in Chicago, a young lawyer, Warren Ingersoll. Writing from the cruise ship Mauritania a couple of months into the trip, Anne complained of boredom, adding,
"I wish you were here with me, Snooks. We'd have a whirl. As it is, the sea is blue, and I love you."
A month later, Anne was angry at her mother for not taking her feelings for Warren seriously.
"She showed no enthusiasm. We're going to have a busy fall. Maybe we can work it up in her. If not, then it's just too bad."
Warren's reply,
"I'm sorry to hear of your mother's lack of enthusiasm. I won't take it personally as I might. Naturally, no one is good enough for her daughter. I believe it."
He also suggested Carroll Russell's doubts might be rooted in the feeling Anne wasn't mature enough for marriage.
"You are, in her eyes, an unpredictable and unfathomable child."
Anne stayed on in Europe for 6 months. Her absence took its toll on Warren. Just as Anne was due to return home, he wrote one last letter.
"I'm as close to being unhinged as I've ever been in my life. There's an old proverb, or at least there should be, that runs, 'The best way to lose a girl is to send her off to Europe alone.' So off he went, taking a good part of my personality and all of my hopes and love. Whatever your trip taught you, it showed me that life without you is not worth the gas to end it. Call me when you get to New York. I love you desperately."
About 2.5 years later, Anne and Warren were married in Chicago. Through the decades, Carroll Russell's passion for modern dance continued. As a former Martha Graham dancer put it at her memorial service,
"But her appetite for dance was so ravenous that she found every possible way to be involved."
She served on the Graham Center board for years, eventually becoming vice president.
She quite often came from Chicago to board meetings in New York when others didn't make it across town.
In a 1957 note, Martha thanked her longtime patron.
In a secret way, you know better than anyone I know how much this gift for work means to me, because you are a dancer.
A few years later, Carroll began a collaboration with Louis Horst, who'd composed music for Graham dances for decades, traveling to New York City frequently.
She used to come tape recorder in hand. Louis lived on 10th Street at the time. Carroll got him to talk about each of the forms similar to his class lectures. He would never have gotten to it alone.
The result? Modern Dance Forms, published in 1961, with a foreword by Martha Graham. It examined how Horst's music and Martha's dance borrowed from earlier art forms. Primitivism, archaic art, medievalism. The New York Times would later write that Modern Dance Forms was considered a classic in the field. Carroll Russell thanked her friend Shirley Genther, Elizabeth Stilla, George Bogart's sister, and her old beau Sidney Harris for their editing help, but avoided the limelight herself.
The book concludes with a biographical note on Louis Horst. Carroll Russell, true to form, wanted to take no bows.
She did team up with fellow Chicago dance enthusiast Shirley Genther on another effort to promote modern dance.
It was in Harold Swift's garden, sitting at the feet of Rodin's thinker, that we began to explore and argue and make the connections that resulted in our dialogue on the new dance in relation to other contemporary arts. For the next 5 years, we hopped all over the country, presenting the dialogue at colleges and museums.
In the early 1960s, the Scherers moved for another Iron Curtain diplomatic posting.
This is Warsaw, Poland.
Bud was named Deputy Chief of Mission in Warsaw. Peter and Susan were by now in U.S. boarding schools, but usually in Poland for Christmas.
The houses are all coal gray because of the dust.
The Scherers began sending tapes back to family in the U.S., Tony playing piano.
Are you ready, Mr. Chopin?
I guess so. Hello, America.
Play-by-play of spirited family card games.
It's the end of an international contest of a famous game called Spit.
Susie, I can beat you at this game with no trouble at all.
They're putting out their cards now. The tempers are pretty high. Albert, I think you cheated.
I didn't cheat a darn bit.
4,700 miles away, Chicago relatives were also taping during their Christmas celebrations at Carroll Russell's apartment on Cedar Street.
We miss you and wish you all a Merry Christmas.
Little Chris Ingersoll made animal noises for the relatives in Warsaw.
What's the lion say?
His father talked about the family's recent move to Hyde Park.
I don't know whether you've heard much about the house, but it's the same one that Harold and Margot were in for about 9 months.
For years, making audio tapes was as much a part of Carroll Russell's Christmas celebrations as opening gifts, or overeating a sumptuous meal prepared by her cook Mary Mulray. Warren traditionally napped right after the meal before the crowd took a walk by the lake.
This is Christmas 1968. We are having a wonderful time. Jingle bells, jingle bells. This is Carroll Russell Bogart speaking, and I am 7 years old, and I am getting very hungry for dinner. Jingle bells, jingle bells, jingle all the way. My name is Jared. I'm almost 5. And guess what? Christmas really does make me happy.
Some family members had double holiday celebrations at 70 Cedar. One on the 4th floor, another in the 17th floor penthouse. Harold Russell had fallen in love with Margot Stratford, not the girl next door, but the girl 13 stories up. Their elevator romance leading to marriage in June of 1961. Leading to their family's split holiday celebrations at 70 Cedar.
Oh, what fun it is to ride a one-horse open sleigh!
Harold and Margot's courtship had included a trip to Lakeside to see Harold Swift. His namesake's wedding was one of the last major Russell family celebrations that Swift would attend. The last photographic image of him was taken in May 1962 in front of his Lakeside home with Harold Russell. The next month, frequent Lakeside guest James Brown IV would note Harold Swift's passing in the Chickeming Farm guest book, adding, "God bless his noble soul." Harold Swift asked that there be no eulogies at his memorial service, but friends like Chuck Percy paid tribute in writing.
He was a truly humble man who grew great because he believed his responsibilities, not himself, were important. He was a conservative in the finest sense, a chronicler of the past whose respect for history brought reason and perspective into the present, hope into the future.
Harold Swift's estate totaled $7.5 million. He left 2/3 of it to the University of Chicago. Half the money was in an endowment fund, which helped fund an economics faculty position in the name of his friend Pete Russell. The first Paul Russell Distinguished Professor was Milton Friedman, who, 14 years later, would win a Nobel Prize. Harold Swift also bequeathed his beloved Chickeming Farm to the U of C. Carroll Russell writing,
"He fancied it could be made into a conference center, where university internal problems and forward-looking ideas could be thrashed out, or where invited experts could ponder more general ideas. If that idea should be deemed impractical, its grounds and dwellings could serve as a sort of faculty vacation property."
The Swift will also provided substantial inheritances to the Russell children and bequeathed the house Norman Barker had used for years to Carroll Russell. It was dubbed the Hig, after Harold Higgins Swift. Though the death of her friend hurt Carroll Russell, she took solace in her family.
"I'm sitting at my desk in the bedroom looking out at a very sodden world."
Not long after Harold Swift's death, she recorded her thoughts to send to daughter Carol in Poland, expressing happiness at being able to watch the families of Lindy and Ann and Harold grow in Chicago, especially now that her youngest had picked a career track.
But right now I envision myself as a practicing private international lawyer.
With evident pride, Carroll Russell spoke of a big new opportunity for Paul, who'd been teaching and researching at Columbia.
He was being considered for the Dr. Churchill's post at Mass General. He said to me, "I think they're trying to make up their mind whether they want a young egghead or a person of some standing."
They went for the young egghead, and Paul Russell would practice at Massachusetts General Hospital and teach at Harvard for more than 50 years. The museum at Mass General is named for him. Back in 1962, Carroll Russell reflected on her children's and her good fortune.
"You can imagine how proud I am of all of you, how lucky I feel I am. Everybody well, everybody growing. As from where I sit, everybody happy. And not many people that can boast like that."
While the generations below were thriving, Granny, Paul Russell's mother, died in 1964 at age 99. She'd been born the day of Abraham Lincoln's death. Adeline Mayo Russell Kidd had lived with her daughter-in-law at 70 Cedar and in Lakeside for 14 years after Pete's death. Also in 1964, Carroll Russell wrote her children.
I think each of us got the same letter. She really planned to do away with herself.
And she said, this may sound terrible, but I will take my own life if it seems to be the proper thing to do.
It's just that my judgment weighed the future and found it to have diminishing returns. You must not grieve, but accept our separation as part of life's eventualities and rejoice with me that we were all spared the ugliness of my being helpless or in pain or incapable of making my own decisions.
I was sad about it. I didn't want her to do it, but it was very consistent with her approach.
And we all said, "Oh, no, Mother." She said, no, it's okay. It's not because I don't love you that I would do it. It's because I do love life, but I don't want to live it if it's going to be in pain and agony. And I understood it, and I wasn't upset by it.
The University of Chicago did not embrace Chickeming Farm as a conference center, selling the main house and grounds to James and Alice Hormel less than 2 years after Harold Swift's death. Hormel was a U of C law school dean and member of another meatpacking family. Harold Swift's will mandated that Carroll Russell approve any sale. Though much of the farm continued to function, the university removed the copy of Rodin's The Thinker that had been the centerpiece of the Swift garden, and divested other Swift guest houses as well. Ed and Joan Brown and 7 children from South Bend bought one of the lakefront cottages. Music professor Leonard Meyer and wife Lee bought another, the house across Lakeshore Road where Swift's chauffeur Stanley Holmes had stayed. Chicago Dr. Roger Pintz and his wife Gail moved into a cottage that had been occupied by former U of C President Lawrence Kimpton. Hormel and Pint's children were folded into the Russell family plays, a tradition which flourished with a new generation of thespians in the 1960s. Some plays, like this rendition of Snow White and Rose Red, were performed in a clearing in the woods, the drain field for the Russell septic system behind the Playhouse garage, dubbed by Carroll Scherer, Greenwood on the Cess. When a younger cast came of age in 1967, they performed Cinderella on the lawn next to the new Russell tennis court, located in a meadow where Harold Swift's cows had once grazed. The court had been built the year before, grapevines planted along the back fence. Playgoers sat along those fences. Some of Harold Swift's relatives, nieces Narcissa King and Ruth Van Ice, and sister-in-law Lydia Swift, still a part of the lakeside scene, attended the play. 2 years later, the porch of the just-built Meadow House debuted as a stage for dramatic productions. The first, a revival of The Interrupted Boar Hunt, the very first Russell family play in 1934. The Meadow House provided a venue on which plays would be staged for decades.
Thing was gross.
Carol Bogert, who'd played Cinderella back in 1967, would in the 2000s take over the director's role from Carroll Scherer. In the 1960s, Carroll Russell created costumes for new generations of junior thespians and took part in occasional skits with her grandchildren. Here she is playing a mean-spirited teacher known as Miss Goggins. She also performed in amateur Chicago productions.
And here I am in the Revels with the Dean of Students.
She was a regular with the Revels, a group founded in 1904 that staged musicals, poking fun at life on the U of C campus. Near the end of each summer, her family had begun serenading Carroll Russell with a performance of their own, usually at what had been dubbed a burning basket farewell. The family would gather to say farewell to a departing family group, often near the spot at the foot of the playhouse where papered trash was burned in a metal can. The song, a creation of Carroll Scherer, became a tradition.
We have a darling grandmama we'd like to tell you all, who's oh so witty and ever so pretty and always on the ball. The big smalls and the small smalls and everyone else agrees. She's just about the jolliest sport you'd ever like to see. Oh, darling bonbon, oodly oodly oo. Oh, darling bonbon, oodly oodly, we love you beautifully. We hope you weathered the awful storm. You've really been a dear. And we'll go home so you can rest up and get ready for us next year.
In 1965, Lindy would take a page from her mother's activism and support of civil rights. After marchers calling for equal voting rights were brutalized by police in Selma, Alabama in March 1965, voting rights supporters from around the country converged on Selma in protest. Lindy went, with a group organized by a suburban Chicago synagogue, taking a long bus ride to Selma, sleeping on a church pew there, and then marching for several miles with thousands of others from around the country. The group was protected by National Guardsmen, though unrepentant racists jeered marchers from the roadside. Out-of-towners like Lindy walked only for a few hours. A federal judge had limited the rest of the march to Montgomery, the state capital, to only a few hundred demonstrators. But Selma proved pivotal. A new Federal Voting Rights Act was signed into law later that year. In 1967, Albert Scherer got his first ambassadorial assignment in Togo. Carroll Scherer wrote of her first impressions.
I stepped out of the plane, and when I took a deep breath, I thought my trachea must have been permanently damaged. It was 104 degrees hot, nothing like Poland.
The ambassador's job meant a pleasant house in the capital of Lomé and was a step up the career ladder for Bud, but
I could see almost right away that I would have truly nothing to do. Relatively few formal duties. So I set out to try to know Togo.
She traveled around the country by car, visiting factories, cities, towns, and markets.
There were beautiful and unusual pieces of art and craftsmanship which could perhaps be commercialized.
Beautiful batik fabrics particularly caught her eye and eventually led her to a new venture, a boutique she called Togo a Go-Go, housed in an unused embassy building.
We started designing clothes right away, made from the beautiful fabrics we found in the central market.
Sales of the boutique's bright garments with elaborate embroidery got an early boost when New York Times correspondent Gloria Emerson spotlighted Togo a Go-Go, saying, "It has an awful name but is probably the best boutique in West Africa." Though Emerson pointed out that profits went to support Togolese education, a Washington Star article a year later prompted the White House to investigate whether Carroll Scherer and other embassy wives were making money on the venture. They weren't, and the investigation concluded Togo a Go-Go had, quote, furthered U.S. national interests. The shop did not last long after the Scherers were transferred elsewhere, but Togo a Go-Go garments make occasional appearances at lakeside social occasions, even 50 years later. The Scherers would spend 5 years in West Africa, posted in Togo, Equatorial Guinea, and Guinea, where Carroll Russell would visit in 1971, sketching her room in the ambassador's residence, much as her mother had sketched scenes of their tour of Europe 61 years earlier. In Lakeside, the estate that had gone from Swift to Hormel was sold to another family in the meat business in 1971. John Thompson raised cattle on his Monee, Illinois farm. Cattle sold to both Swift and Hormel. He also fancied railroads. He had train cars and even a miniature train on his farm. And he raised grapes there as well, gaining some renown for producing Illinois' first champagne. Thompson had similar designs in Michigan, according to his property caretaker, Steve Salisbury.
The vineyard included perhaps 6 rows of grapes, which I believe were French hybrids. John Thompson had Ray Olson plant these, so they were young vines. During my tenure, they did not do well at all.
Most buildings at Chickaming Farm were still standing, including the big white house on the hill by the lake. Thompson kept goats and even a llama, but the Swift formal gardens were long gone. After a few years, Thompson gave up on growing grapes in Michigan. The provision in Harold Swift's will, giving Carroll Russell a say, had lapsed.
My not very legal control had been used up. In 1977, Chickaming Farm, next to our place, was metamorphosed into an affluent subdivision.
A new road to what would become Swift Estates was built right down the middle of what had been Harold Swift's Showplace Gardens. Some of Carroll Russell's grandchildren would eventually purchase homes on Swift Lane. 1973 saw the first Russell family wedding in Lakeside in almost a quarter century.
Both of us had lived all over the world, so the idea of a beloved place where the family has gathered for decades was natural.
The wedding of Susan Scherer and Peter Osnos took place in that clearing in the woods where plays had been performed a decade earlier, the septic drain field now nicknamed Chapel on the Cess. Father of the bride, Bud Scherer, had put sod down for the occasion.
Albert spent days out there with a watering hose to keep the newly laid turf a sparkling green.
Carroll Russell was the officiant.
I had only met Ba a time or two, but knowing what she meant to Suze and the warmth which she welcomed me into the fold made it an honor that she said yes.
The ceremony we wrote came from sources that reflected our different family backgrounds and our common values and beliefs.
This was an era before you could get a license to perform weddings online. So to make it technically legal, we went to a justice of the peace in St. Joe.
It would be 17 more years before the next Russell family wedding in Lakeside, but they would become more frequent in the 1990s. Carol Bogert and Alex Papachristou were married in 1990. Nina Russell and Tom Rubin in 1992. Amy Bogert and Robert Baldwin in that same year. Nick Bogart and Sally Shaw in 1999, Catherine Osnos and Colin Sanford in 2003, and Wiley Scherer and Nate Fry in 2015. Even weddings that took place elsewhere often prompted lakeside celebration.
Rolling, 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 keep those outlaws rolling.
New family members often welcomed into the Russell family as outlaws.
A groom who's well past beta, who's wrangling big data. You'll see him dancing later in Lakeside.
The Osnos wedding in 1973 produced Carroll Russell's first great-grandchild, Catherine, a couple of years later. As of 1972, Bud Scherer had a new and more glamorous posting, the Scherers moving into the Paycheck Palace, the ambassadorial residence in Prague, Czechoslovakia. Bud was also appointed to head the U.S. delegation to the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, which produced an agreement known as the Helsinki Accords. In his obituary, the LA Times would note,
30 months of negotiations led to the charter recognizing a European map changed by Soviet annexation and pledging that Soviet bloc countries would allow a freer flow of information and people across borders. Scherer was given special credit for the human rights provisions of the Accords.
Bud was with President Gerald Ford, with whom he'd worked as a lawyer in Grand Rapids in his pre-Foreign Service days, when the Accords were signed in Helsinki. In the mid-1970s, Harold Russell was also working on diplomacy with the Soviets as legal counsel for the State Department's Europe Bureau. And Carroll Russell and daughter Anne took a grand trip to London to see Martha Graham dance in 1976. Anne's journal noting that the Queen Mother and Princess Margaret were seated nearby and told of visiting Graham in her apartment at the Savoy Hotel for tiny sandwiches and drinks. In 1978, her children plotted a surprise party for Carroll Russell's 80th birthday. 4 months ahead of time, Carol Scherer sent a memo to the family proposing a celebration at her home in Greenwich, Connecticut. Bud was just retiring from the Foreign Service. She urged everyone to preserve the element of surprise.
It is my suggestion that I ask Bon to come down for the weekend or more. On the day, Saturday, you would all, of course, phone her to wish her the merriest and express regrets that you can't see her.
Carol Scherer also proposed that 4 groups produce themed skits. Family members living in Chicago would present Granny in Crime, Bostonians, Life in the City, Washingtonians, Life in the Country, and New Yorkers, The Traveling Life. Childhood friends of Carol Mason were consulted by performing groups seeking anecdotes to work into their presentations. The surprise was real. Some worried the shock of seeing almost 30 of her nearest and dearest yelling "surprise" might not be good for the matriarch's health. She'd had 2 coronaries, but she described it as the most impossibly exciting and happy sight of her long life. Life in the City featured scenes about her interest in dance, a flight of fancy about the Harris Bank suddenly becoming avant-garde in its taste in sculpture, with actors playing statues, and it ended with disco dancing. Life in the Country portrayed her in her crib, making sweeping motions, a nod to her lifelong fondness for sweeping her driveway in Lakeside. Traveling Life included episodes of the trip to Europe with her mother as a child, and concluded with her sketch of the Scherer home in Togo being awarded a prize at Chicago's Art Institute. As for Granny in Crime, music from the police drama Dragnet led into Carol Mason's childhood membership in the Teddy Bear Club, an innocent club for neighborhood girls now portrayed as a street gang, when rowdy neighborhood boys intrude on their meeting. Dragnet music also introducing a Lakeside constable's investigation into who picked Harold Swift's garden clean of its fruits and vegetables. The prime suspect in that skit beamed throughout it all and wrote all the participants afterward, thanking them for their presence and performance and saying,
I was laughing so much that it's a good thing I have the incomparable script so I can find out what was going on all the time.
In 1982, Carroll Russell wrote and self-published a memoir entitled The University of Chicago and Me, which began,
My love affair with the University of Chicago began when I was 3.
The book recounted her education at the university's lab school, her time as a student at the U of C itself, leading her, of course, to her romance with Pete Russell, her friendship with Harold Swift, and to Lakeside, and eventually to her large and growing family, now into a fourth generation. She traveled frequently to see far-flung offspring, putting much time and effort into staying in touch. Her friend Shirley Genther at her memorial service said she rejoiced in her grandchildren's accomplishments and reveled in their individuality.
A stream of letters flowed from her desk at 70-seater, augmented, of course, by Carroll's famous clipping service.
Bongrams, some called them, sometimes handwritten, sometimes typed, sometimes featuring stick figures in dance poses. The last of them was probably this postcard, featuring a painting of the Chicago lakefront, part of Harold Swift's bequest to the Smart Museum at the U of C, sent to her namesake granddaughter Carroll Russell Bogert. In it, she looks forward to a February visit. But 2 days after that card was postmarked, Carroll Russell died of an apparent heart attack in her Chicago apartment, though her children, who'd received that 1964 letter about suicide, had at least a flicker of doubt.
And we were all sort of wondering when she dropped dead, as she did, whether she had taken something. And there was never any autopsy, and I don't think anybody wanted to really answer that question.
At the time of her death, though, Carroll Russell seemed to be energetically forward-looking, writing friends urging that they attend an upcoming Martha Graham performance, lamenting,
"I've never known why, but Chicago is not a dance town."
A week after her death, the Tribune's dance critic noted that Graham's return to Chicago was welcome but tinged with sadness, saying the loss of Carroll Russell deprived Graham and the entire community of modern dance of a great and valued friend. Months later, American Dance magazine also spotlighted Carroll Russell's support of Graham and called her a quiet heroine of the dance. Newspaper obituaries noted her devotion not only to modern dance, but also the university and other civic causes. Her family gathered a few weeks after her death at the Court Theater on the University of Chicago campus for a memorial service.
Carroll wanted the arts to shine here, to illuminate the gray stones.
The service followed by a reception at the Smart Art Museum next door, and then a family gathering in Lakeside, a weekend reunion and remembrance of the family matriarch. Her 5 children placed her ashes at the foot of a tree outside her bedroom picture window that she dubbed Mrs. Ash. The cremated remains of both Carroll and Pete Russell were returned to Lakeside, the place their friend Harold Swift helped make the home of their heart. The nuclear Russell family had grown to 11 before Pete's death in 1950. There were 14 people in the 1954 Christmas card labeled the complete Russell clan. Pretty much every summer, a new family photo was taken in Lakeside. The numbers growing each year. Beginning in the 1970s, the crowds were big enough so a couple of photos would be taken and stitched together by Carroll Russell. She had 23 direct descendants when she died in 1983. As this film is made 40 years later, there are 66 direct descendants, and nearly 100 members of the extended family gather in summer in Lakeside, relishing the setting and the sentiment. All of it a gift from Bon, Dee, and Uncle Harold Swift.